Today we are joined by Erin Schalk. Erin Schalk is a visual artist, a writer, a poet, an educator. She has an MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago, has exhibited in the United States, Europe, Japan, has been in several publications, and has this incredible program called Bridging Art, in addition to a couple of other things. Erin, I'm going to ask you to share a bit more about yourself.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you so much for having me today on your podcast. I am someone who does a number of different things. I've trained as a visual artist, just like
Mhm.
Cindy was describing, primarily as a painter, but I have expanded that work into a variety of other media. So everything from photography to ceramics, also video production, audio production, that kind of thing as well. As a visual artist, my work started to grow into writing. This happened a number of years back, actually, when I was a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. The writing started to grow into different types of poetry as well as prose. So I am balancing those two roles, those two
Mhm.
types of creative output. In the past few years, I have been focusing a little bit more on the writing piece of things. I have a rough novel manuscript that I'm continuing to work on, and I have some new poems that will be coming out in publications in the coming months. In addition to that, I'm an educator, and I began teaching back in 2011. I
Mhm.
was living in Japan at the time. So it was a situation where I was finding different types of educational opportunities. I was living in Okinawa, Japan. So, working with the local community, as well as working with international communities related to the US military primarily, then. So, it was a situation where the idea of bridging, trying to bridge two very distinct different worlds, really started to grow a little seed in my mind at the time.
May I
Yes,
ask you, what exactly were those bridges that were forming that you were helping with?
right. So what was happening then, this is of course 12 years ago. So I cannot speak for the situation now. But there was definitely, say, a distinct separation in most cases where a lot of American individuals living on the military bases would stay fairly shut in there, shut in those communities. And then for individuals, Okinawans, who are living in their communities as well, there was basically these two very distinct worlds, and it wasn't a situation where both worlds would interact a great deal, almost a sense of segregation in a way. And so, what I tried to do in my 3 years there, it wasn't a long time, but I would offer classes in the visual arts as well as creative writing to a degree. And these would be open to individuals from both communities. So it was an opportunity to start to bring people together rather than keep people very separate and distinct. So I think about this now, 12 years later,
Right.
and how in the span of the short time I was there, that there were small steps that I was able to help with. But of course, having a longer time to really get established, I think would have been beneficial. But what I continued to hear, and what I believed personally too, still believe at
Mhm.
the time, is that in visual arts, there's a certain universal language that can exist. And so that was what I was trying to bring forward, create these creative opportunities for everyone, regardless of
Right.
age or background or anything like that.
So, in many ways, it seems like this was the seed for your leadership in terms of building human connections, those bridges that you were talking about, as well as community. And that is such a perfect segue for something I wanted to ask you about, which I think is quite fascinating. You do teach people who are visually impaired as well as have autism. It's part of this global type of work that you started in terms of everybody can relate to art regardless of background. I'd like to ask you to share with our listeners about the Bridge Building Art Program, but also if you could tell us about these three core values that are part of bridging art that I read on your website, which was persistent authenticity, compassionate passion, and accessibility and empowerment. Can you talk about those things?
Digging into this question, I think where this all started, I grew up in a situation where I had a very strong drive to create art, whether that was visual arts, whether that was creative writing, and I really did not have a lot of access to it for a long time. And that had to do with basically the location and the time period in which I grew up, that there just weren't opportunities in the very small Midwestern town in which I lived. So I understood from a very personal perspective when individuals have that desire, that drive, that calling, whatever you would like to call it, and how difficult it can be and frustrating it can be when those opportunities don't exist. So taking those ideas and currently too, like you were mentioning, I work with visually impaired adults primarily. And when I was first starting out this program, the disconnect between vision loss and opportunities for those with vision loss to experience the visual arts was massive. A lot of arts organizations just do not have the knowledge, don't have the resources, are not equipped to provide accessible art experiences. And in some cases, there is a belief, a myth, that if you cannot see, you cannot experience visual art. But of course, if we think about the visual arts in terms of a multisensory sort of experience, say the auditory aspects of art or experiencing art in a tactile way, with one sense of touch, how that can start to open many more doors. Keeping all of this in mind, and in terms of, say, autism spectrum and a number of other types of disabilities that may occur with a certain diagnosis. Sometimes I work with students with memory loss, hearing loss, stroke survivors, all those kinds of things, really helping tap into different aspects of the senses and different aspects of memory and relating those to the visual arts, also to the creative writing side of things too, can start to open up a lot of opportunities. So getting back to the 3 points that you mentioned, the persistent authenticity, and then the compassionate passion and the accessibility and empowerment, I'll go through those one at a time. So when I started to develop my practice with bridging art, the idea that came to mind, those that have the courage or the opportunity to really engage in creative work. And I am a person who does believe that everyone has some element of creativity, that for some people that might be the highest level of fine arts, for some people that might be a more personal craft. I try not to make a hierarchy or distinctions between those because I personally feel as an educator and as an artist, it's much better for an individual to tap into that creative side versus trying to tamp it down, especially if, say, some organization or some teacher in the past has told them, well, that's not good enough, that's not real art, kind of a thing. I find that that's more destructive than if a person has the ability to really engage authentically. So persistent authenticity, engage authentically in those aspects of their creative self, their creative yearnings that really stand out to them, that they are called to do, that by the end of the day, if they've engaged in that,
Right.
they feel that sense of, I did part of what I was supposed to do today. So that's where the authenticity piece, that's the idea behind that. In terms of compassionate passion, teasing that one out a bit, I've been teaching for a while, and I've been teaching in every kind of situation you could imagine, good and bad, but I've been placed in teaching situations where typically I had a lot of creative agency to develop a program and to develop it to a particular audience. And for me, that's been a good thing. What I've discovered, though, over the course of my time teaching all ages, everyone from pre-K through their 90s, is that there's this piece of accessibility, and that 2 and 3 kind of they connect, they chain link a little bit. For individuals who experience disability, a lot of the time there is just so much that is lacking in
Right.
terms of opportunities. And I even meet educators sometimes who already have a belief that someone with a certain impairment just cannot do a certain thing. When you have a situation like that, you're really kind of doomed from the start, so to speak. So I've had to learn that in order to really foster the best possible outcomes for my students, that piece, that compassion piece is so important. I have to stand back as an educator on a number of levels and really try as best as I can to put myself in that person's shoes, understanding that I cannot fully know what their experience is like, but really taking the time to say, okay, I'm going to close my eyes right now and I'm going to try to create this project. And what are the pitfalls? What are the challenges? And how, as an educator, can I support that and improve that? And what I find is, especially when we're learning about creative things, we're working creatively, we're teaching creatively, we're engaging in creative projects. So many, especially adults, and I work primarily with adults, many adults have already encountered a fair amount of creative wounding, whether that was from parents, whether that was from a teacher, someone in a position of authority who either downgraded or belittled what they were doing, or told that there is no future in this, or there's no future in this for you. And so I've found that through compassion and also being passionate, really, truly, honestly excited about what I'm teaching and what I'm helping people experience, this is where that opening starts to happen instead of that shutting down. And it's so easy, I think, for a lot of individuals, especially if they've gone through some level of creative wound, to shut down really quickly. That's where that compassionate passion comes in. And then, of course, for number 3, accessibility and empowerment through creative practice. For me, I was working in the accessibility space primarily since 2018. And I understood this, how to create accessible arts programs for individuals with disabilities. I understood this from a hands-on level, from an intellectual level, but not quite on a personal level until 2020. And that was when a close family member of mine received an autism diagnosis. And this happened right as the pandemic was hitting. And it was very scary because, on the one hand, okay, this is the situation and we need to be able to help support this. And then on the other hand, everything was shutting down. So access to support, access to, say, medical support, educational support, all that kind of thing was all shutting down. It was this moment of having to learn about this and understand about this from a much more personal level. And what I discovered over the course of these past 3 years now, I can't say this happens to every individual in every situation, but I see far too often that the focus becomes very narrow. It becomes on what that person cannot do. And that starts to become that person's identity.
Right.
I'm
And we are
right.
more than the labels that get placed on us.
Yes.
I really like that you said that, because I'll share something personal. I have what is called a hidden disability, a disability you don't see, which is I have type 1 diabetes, and many people know this about me. And it's not something that you can see, but it's part of my life. People often say, oh, you're diabetic, you're this, you're that. I said, no, I am not diabetic. I have. Because the moment you start to put people in a box, like you said, you start to identify people a certain way and you don't see them beyond that, beyond how much more an individual is. We are so much more than descriptors or boxes that we are placed in. And it is just absolutely beautiful and empowering that you're saying, okay, no, let's not focus on what a person cannot do. How do we start to understand what someone can do? How can they thrive in spite of? And it seems like engaging in the arts is part of that thriving, if I'm understanding where this is going.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And thank you for sharing with me too, Cindy. I'm a person with an invisible disability as well. Mine has to do with a number of chronic autoimmune issues that have plagued me since childhood. And that invisibility, this sort of space, sometimes, at least from my perspective, and I don't know if this has been the same for you, you feel that tug between the able-bodied world and the world of disability. Because on the outside, the able-bodied world tends to think, oh, you don't show a particular disability, so we expect you to function just like us, kind of a thing. And then in the world of disability, sometimes there's this question of, well, you have the benefit of not demonstrating this outwardly. For example, I don't have a visual impairment to the degree my students do, so I don't have to walk with a white cane. So it's almost having to live in between two worlds that can be really difficult. And like you mentioned too, this situation where a lot of labels are placed upon individuals because of a diagnosis, and taking almost every aspect of that diagnosis and putting that over top of that person as a shroud. It's very challenging in so many ways. And I really appreciate you saying too that we are so much more than any kind of labels that are being placed on us.
Absolutely. I think that a lot of people find comfort in labels, whether it's someone that may not understand that they're boxing somebody else, or the person being boxed, because you can easily go into victim mode, like, oh, poor me, because you keep on being put in a box. You keep on being told these are your limitations, versus saying, okay, I have to live with this. How do I thrive? I consider myself exceedingly blessed because I think I'm healthier than most people in spite of or because of the type 1 diabetes. I'm very cognizant of what I eat. I'm very cognizant about exercise. I have a lot of self-awareness in terms of self-care. And that has made me exceedingly healthy. And some people are like, how are you so healthy? I choose to.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean I don't have a bad day from time to time. We all do. Sometimes my body, once in a while, it does not happen often just because I manage it so well. But once in a while, I have a bad day. But circling back to this idea of boxes, I can see how readily someone can be programmed to see themselves as limited, as a victim, versus doing what you're doing, saying, how can we find solutions? How can we be more? How do we live with some type of challenge, some type of disability? We acknowledge the disability or the challenge. We don't say it doesn't exist, because that's denial and it's certainly unhealthy. But we do say, this does exist. How do I thrive?
Yes.
And not only how do I thrive, I deserve to thrive. I am worthy and deserving of thriving. And when you are boxed, you forget.
Yes.
So I wanted to ping pong and piggyback off of what you had mentioned earlier, and also mention one more thing, which was this beautiful idea of compassion that you talked about. To me, that's one of the strongest forms of leadership that you can come across, that you can embody, is this idea of, I may not understand your situation fully because I'm not walking in your shoes. Like you said, I can see better than somebody with a cane, but how do I have compassion and help you thrive. And that's true leadership, because it's about helping other people rise up. And it's just something really beautiful. In this spirit, my question to you is, what have you noticed with your students in developing this framework of not what can you not do, but what can you do?
Definitely. Obviously, everyone's an individual. Everyone responds a little bit differently. Some of my students are so thirsty for that. They don't necessarily know what they're thirsty for, but once they have that presented to them, this idea of we're not going to focus on what you can't do. We're going to focus on what you can do, and we're going to stretch that definition. You may have say, and I'm holding, for anyone who might be listening on audio, I'm holding my hands maybe about 6 inches apart. You may think that that's about as far as you can go, but we're going to find how much farther you could go. And I'm stretching my hands out to more like 1.5 feet. Some students find that very empowering from the very start, and they take that and they run with that, because even like you were saying, Cindy, so easy to get programmed when you're hearing this from society, from your educators, from your family, from a lot of different sources, get programmed into thinking, I can only function in this very narrow space, and that's it. For some, that breaks down fast, and they're ready to run with that, to take that ball and run with that quickly. For others, for other individuals, again, it depends on their background, depends on their situation. Sometimes that change is much slower, to shed that feeling of victimhood, that this is what I've been told for the majority of my life, that this is all I'm able to do. It takes a while to shed that skin to a degree. So being patient, being compassionate, that those are really key. What I have found, though, over the course of this work for the past few years, that I've not been doing this as long as, say, other things, but my students have really been able to grow in significant ways. Everything from having their works of poetry, works of writing published in international journals or journals that are available on Amazon, to most recently, I've had a student, his artwork is currently on display at one of the museums. It's a pretty major museum in Orange County. We've also worked together, my students and I, with museums here in Orange County, and create these accessible audio video tours. So especially for, say, students who cannot see at all, the technical term is called total blindness. So if one is totally blind, they may not necessarily be able to tell day from night. Basically, I've made these video tours of these art exhibitions, and I do a process called image description, and I'll talk in depth about what the artwork looks like, the textures, the colors, where everything is positioned, and even walk the students through that gallery space. You're going to take a right turn here, and you're going to be at this particular section. It's opened up a great deal of things, definitely. And I think, again, you were talking earlier about thriving, thriving, that's a human desire, a human need. What I want to help our students focus on, what I tend to try to focus on, is looking at these creative experiences. You have this opportunity for cultural participation. You get to be a viewer, to be an audience member with this art exhibition or with this art class, kind of a thing. But you also can think about it in terms of thriving. There are certain things we need to do on a day-to-day basis to survive, to feed ourselves, to make sure we're hydrated, that kind of thing. But how much wider, broader, and richer the world can become when we're engaging in those creative opportunities as well. So I would say on the whole, it's been very positive, and I'm just grateful, very grateful for all the individuals and organizations we've been able to partner with to make these opportunities happen.
Amazing. Erin, because you have done this and developed a lot of these programs, Is there any advice you can give to other educators who want to embark on a similar journey, such as yourself, who want to bring the arts to people who may have barriers to access or may have a disability? What can you share with them?
That's a good question. I think when you really deep down, you have this strong drive, this strong why you're doing it. That is going to be the thing that will help you get through the barriers, get through the difficult parts. And for me, that why really crystallized in my family member and his diagnosis back in 2020. So when I have a day where I'm just overwhelmed at the challenges that are being put in front of me and that are going to affect the people that I serve, I think about that family member and I think about, I'm doing this for him. I'm doing this for everyone who's in this kind of situation. And even if things may look difficult or darn near impossible, right now I have to keep pressing forward and trying to find a way. I think having a strong internal drive to do something, a lot of the time you may have some kind of personal connection to it. It may be something you've experienced, something your family member has experienced. I think those things are going to carry you through because you will come up with solutions and you will be braver, I think, than you thought possible. Solutions will come to you that you won't necessarily have thought of on your own, or if you were doing this for, say, a less compelling reason.
Right.
And then the bravery piece. I find if I'm going to bat for someone else, I tend to be a little braver than if I'm going if I'm going to bat for just something that maybe I want, personally, or maybe it's my ego kind of a thing. I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And now a little bit more about you, because you are such an inspiring educator, truly impacting and changing the world. But you're also a beautiful, fine artist. You have a practice where, of course, you do the poetry you talked about earlier, but you paint beautiful landscapes with a lot of textures. And I call them landscapes because they feel like landscapes, even though there's a lot of abstraction in your work. Tell us a little bit about your work and what inspires you, what motivates you.
Absolutely. In terms of my paintings, just like you were describing, Cindy, there's a lot of abstraction that happens with them to the point where they get to be in this space of almost non-objectivity. And by that, what I mean is some abstract artists, say they're taking photographs, and mine are rooted in landscape in a way, and I'll come back to that, I promise. They take photographs and they start to shift and adjust those realistic elements in that scene, that setting, and they abstract it. Maybe they're changing the colors, changing the shapes, but it still carries the certain physical qualities of that particular reference point. For me, my process doesn't work in that same way. I'm working a great deal from memory. I tend to not say take images as source material, but I have elements, visual elements in my mind that are functioning as source material. And typically, what I find myself doing with the paintings, it's coming from a very internal, personal place. It's almost this space where place and memory intersect. So, as an individual, I may have certain memories, associations that come with a particular place, a particular location. And I sit down, or typically I'll put my painting flat on the ground so I can bend over top and really work around it 360 degrees pretty easily. All of this is more or less coalescing in my mind at once. And usually I'll play some piece of music that has an emotional quality to it. Music, of course, has this tremendous power to bring out certain emotions that connects to that memory that I have with that particular place. And the phrase I was trying to think of earlier that I've used to describe some of these pieces is called poetry of place.
Mm-hmm.
The way I work with the paints, you have these elements of, say, physical landscape. Maybe there's a division, like a third that feels like sky and 2/3 that feel more like ground. But then I'm often changing colors, color schemes. There's a lot of atmosphere that happens in my paintings as well too. So it almost slips between that physical space and a more dreamlike space or a more emotional sort of space. Like, oh,
Almost
yes.
trance-like if you put yourself in a kind of trance-like place where you're creating and bringing everything together to the canvas.
Yes, absolutely. I typically, rather than working on canvas, I work a lot more on wooden panels.
Oh, nice, nice.
Yes, the canvas,
The
I
texture?
texture and a lot of layering and a lot of weight. Sometimes I build
Mhm.
up a lot of materials, and that can unfortunately make a canvas sag a little bit in the middle. Or I've had times where I've accidentally torn them because I had too much material on it. So I found wooden panels being sturdier, solid, they work well.
Mhm.
There's something for me about engagement with material and doing a lot of layering. I compare, say, layering on a canvas to layering of history, and that could be histories associated with a particular physical place. It could be history of one's memory, how we build certain levels of memory are
Right.
related to particular places and emotional states. So the paintings may have layers in them that one will never actually see. They've been coated with so much other material, but it
Mhm.
all starts to work together to create that sense of history and of building upon some sort of foundation.
That's fascinating. And although you are both completely different in many ways, it reminds me of Jasper Johns, who used to also do a lot of layering. Sometimes he would paint on top of newspaper. You have to look with the special X-ray machine to be able to see some of the newspaper. He did a lot of layering, and it's not something that many artists do. And I think that's quite fascinating because there's an attraction to abstract art as a form of expression, which is quite lovely. But then there's taking this idea of abstracting art, but it's abstracting art from an actual object in this that you see in your memory
Mm.
that coalesces into this space. So then there's all these new layers that come in that aren't always seen and perceived or even talked about. So I think it's quite fascinating. I highly encourage our viewers to go to your website and look at your art. Can you share your website with us, please?
Of course. Thank you so much, Cindy. I appreciate your thoughts on the pieces. And my website, my artist portfolio website is my name. My last name is a little bit unusual, but the easiest way to remember my name is the word Schalk, or the last name Schalk is the word chalk with an S in front. So I've had a lot of people remember my name and my website by Erin's Chalk. So ErinSchalk.com. So ErinSchalk.com.
Perfect. And also, can you share with us the website for Bridging Art?
Yes, absolutely. So that one is bridgingart.com as well. Just the word bridging and art, no hyphens or anything like that, bridgingart.com.
I really appreciate you sharing both websites. They're just absolutely lovely and inspiring. You also have a book, Quiet Space. Can you tell us about that?
Of course. So back in 2021, a project that I decided to tackle. I've been wanting to write a book for some time, and this is my small baby step into book publication. In this book called Quiet Space, 2021, we were still fairly deep into the pandemic, and something that I felt would be beneficial for a lot of people would be having some kind of opportunity to become more creative, especially if you're working from home and the limitations of, say, being disconnected from a creative community, but then also really taking time to go deeply
Mhm.
into, say, one's thoughts, one's emotions be highly reflective because we were so shut in for the most
Right.
part.
We were
It was,
shuttered.
yes, definitely. So I wanted to bring all of those things up
Mhm.
into this book, and this book is a combination of a number of things. It's an unusual book that you would necessarily find on most store shelves. What it brings together, it brings in elements of visual artwork, it brings in fragments of poetry, and it also brings in these short personal essays. With those three different pieces, each one functions as a prompt. So a visual artwork might be presented, and I wrote a prompt based on that work. So maybe that artwork has a great deal to do with time. And so I write a prompt based on time. And
Mhm.
it's for you as say someone consuming that book, it encourages you to spend quiet reflective time with that piece
Mhm.
and then write your responses based on that prompt. Basically, it's a part creativity book, part journal. What I found is that it does help you if you really take the time with it to slow down and to almost excavate, say certain things that may be causing you challenges, whether that's in your personal life and your professional life, also help you excavate different types of creative projects you may want to engage in more readily.
Mhm.
So I would recommend too for anyone who's in, say, kind of a space of flux, a transitional space, and you're trying to find some sort of grounding, this book can help you a great deal with going inward more, being more reflective, and figuring out ways to grow and expand your own creativity.
Thank you. And where would people go to buy this? On Amazon or your website? Where would people find this book?
So it is on Amazon. It's also on bookshop.org. I do have a link to it on Bridging Art. So if you go to bridgingart.com and you select articles, there is a section that talks about the book Quiet Space, and it will link you to where you can purchase it online. You can also search for my name. So if you go, say, to bookshop.org or Amazon, search for Erin Schalk and then Quiet Space, and it should come up in your search.
Perfect. I'm thrilled that you were able to join us this week and share how you're creating impact. And what I really appreciated was that this impact is coming from your personal why, which is your family member that has autism, and that you truly care. So as we wrap up this session, is there any advice you can give to leaders or artists that they can take with them in their everyday lives as well as into the workplace?
Absolutely. Leaders first and then artists. And I
Mhm.
think in terms of leadership, we often have a more antiquated notion of leadership as authoritarian, as I am the top person in a hierarchical chain, and I say a certain thing, and everyone should be following what I say. What I've found, and I look at teaching and education as a really strong form of leadership. I also look at this in terms of if you're an artist, a creator, you have the ability to innovate and create. If you do this from primarily a place of what I like to call servant leadership, where you're taking your ego out of it as best as possible, and you're thinking about how can I, just like you were saying earlier, Cindy, how can I start to lift the people up who are around me because that causes this wider chain reaction of
Mhm.
sorts. If we're all starting to rise, how much more beneficial things can be for everyone. So I always try to think about that, whether I'm teaching, whether I'm leading, or doing both at the same time. I'm trying to think about those that I'm serving and thinking about what can benefit them. What can I do that can really benefit them, help them grow, empower them, give them tools that they didn't have before? And I do that in small ways every day. I ask myself that every day before I go into this meeting, before I go into this class, how can I do this? But then I also take time too, and I recommend this too for emerging leaders. Take time to reflect maybe every quarter if you could do that during the year and really start to map out, what am I doing that's facilitating a positive impact? What am I doing or what is missing that can help empower and make things better for those that I'm working with?
And, and,
So,
and if I may interject,
yes.
Erin, what you have said is not just for emerging leaders. They are for actualized leaders who have been in positions of power for a long period of time. Because you did say that we have some very antiquated notions of leadership, which I completely agree with you. I think it's important for rising leaders to understand these concepts because they are the future. But I also thought it was a great place to interject that established leaders can also do that, because we can easily become a little too comfortable in our way of doing things, thinking we know it all. And
Mm.
yet there's always ways to innovate. Like you said, checking in every quarter. How am I doing? So thank you for sharing that, and for allowing me to interject.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Cindy. And I agree. I think any level of leadership, it's important to keep that level of humility, in a positive way, not a negative form of
Mhm,
humility, but also too, I think in terms of, say, being an artist, whether one may be more emerging as an artist or more established as an artist, the best advice I can think of, it's really top of mind. Something that I've seen happen time and again with artists, whether they're visual artists, whether they're creative writers, there can be this push or this pressure to assess what is popular, what is trending right now in the
mhm.
creative space, and
Yes.
almost shoehorn or kind of pigeonhole yourself into one of those pegs, so to speak, and create art that you feel like is going to garner a lot of attention, maybe a lot of, say, like media notoriety, positive attention, that kind of thing. But in time, that will start to break down, because if you're not creating your work from that very authentic sort of place, from what your why is, what really drives you personally,
Mhm,
what your natural abilities are. Some people are more inclined to certain media versus others. Some people are more inclined to certain media versus others. Some media is considered to be more, and I use quotation marks, antiquated. But if you're not really following the direction that you are meant to, if you're not authentically creating from the media and from, I should say, materials, and
mhm,
from the ideas that compel you, that drive you, it won't be beneficial for you in the
mm,
long run, and you won't be able to provide that level of influence in a positive way if you're really allowing yourself to fit yourself into that kind of that puzzle piece that you belong in, and you're making the work that you are meant to be making.
mhm,
The floodgates almost start to open, and they do this naturally, and people will start to be attracted to what you do. It's a certain kind of charisma, and I cannot quantify it. I cannot talk about it in scientific terms. But when you do that, that's when you start to make a great impact as an artist with your work. So, again, that does take some time for reflection. Definitely, you might say be on one track for a while, and then it can be very disconcerting when you find that track shifting. Maybe your voice is changing and you're having to focus elsewhere. But again, taking those times to pause and reflect and do that gut check. Does this
mhm.
seem right? Does this feel right? Or when I get done with this, does something feel out of synchronization?
I love that. Thank you so much. And it brings us full circle to this idea of authenticity, of not just persistent authenticity, but authenticity of the self, because I do think that on some subconscious level, people can sense when you're not authentic, whether you're an artist or whether, let's say, you're a top CEO of a corporation. And when there's this sense of inauthenticity, it's hard to connect.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to feel that interest and investment. So thank you for that incredible sage advice. Thank you, Erin, for being with us today on PreZence. It has been an absolute joy, and I am certain our listeners are taking a lot of beautiful sage advice with them.
Oh, thank you so much, Cindy. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you again for having me on PreZence. And I'm wishing you the very best as this podcast continues to grow and with all of your extremely important work.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on PreZence. For more information on how you can create greater levels of impactful presence in your professional and personal life, visit www.cindyurrutia.com and follow me on social media. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Feel free to post a comment and we'll read it on the show.